Vanderwall with the Fraser Basin Council. Welcome to our webinar today on information and funding for First Nations climate change adaptation planning. Looks like we have a great turnout today. Lots of interest in this topic. And this is part of our BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative Series. So hopefully you're able to hear us. If you have any technical issues, please let us know using the chat or question function. Just wanted to say a little bit about BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative before we get started. We run a number of events and activities to try and support local governments, First Nations, and others with incorporating future climate into their decisions and plans. Things like the retooling website, webinars such as the one you're participating in today, and there's also a searchable database of resources on our website. Also wanted to mention that we do have a couple of events coming up, well, here's a picture of retooling that you might be interested in. There is a handout that's part of the webinar tool that you can download. The first one is the Nicola Symposium, which is focused on collaboration in that sensitive watershed on February 1st and 2nd in Merritt. And we're doing that in partnership with the Nicola Valley Institute of Technology. There's a registration link where you can register, and the focus is on kind of bringing people together who are doing research in the watershed, as well as resource managers to learn about what each is doing, and also to do some thinking about how future climate can be considered. The second event that's coming up is Legal Implications of Climate Change for Professionals on the 22nd of February. That's in Vancouver and is in partnership with Engineers and Geoscientists Canada. So looking at what are the considerations that professionals should take when looking at future climate in their practices. So if you'd like to find out about future opportunities like this, you can sign up to our email list, and there's a red box you can see that's on our website. If you go there, you can type in your email. And also we record webinars like this one, and so there's also a place you can go to the website on the toolbar where you can click on our past recordings. Sorry, I'd already talked about these events and the handout that you can download. So in terms of webinar logistics, for those of you who have participated before, this will be old hat, but we keep the audio muted for all the participants because there's so many people on the line. But we do encourage you to ask questions and use the question box, which we'll get to at the end of the presentations. And if you have any technical difficulties, my colleague Lena Chia will help you out. There's an email there, fraserbasin@gmail.com, or you can use the chat or question functions to ask us questions. So we're pleased to have two speakers today that to talk about both the programs as well as information that First Nations may want to be looking at in adaptation planning. First speaker is Tom Duncan, who's with the First Nations ADAPT program at Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. He's a policy analyst there with the program, and he's worked on the climate change file most recently on adaptation for almost 5 years. And he previously worked on green energy programming and land use planning, and has a background in biology and a very career over environmental management, commercial fishing, and information technology. Trevor Murdoch is also with us, and Trevor is a climate scientist with an undergrad degree in physics and astronomy from the University of Victoria, and master's in earth and ocean sciences from UVic as well. And Trevor leads the Regional Climate Impacts theme at PCIC. So over the last 20 years, he's worked on applications of climate research to assist decision-making and planning. And Trevor's work is focused on climate scenarios and online mapping tools, downscaling to high resolution, analysis of historical climate data, and improvement of seasonal climate predictions. And if you are going to the Nicola Symposium, you'll have a chance to meet Trevor in person. He'll be there presenting on some of the local climate information that could be considered in that watershed. So I'm just going to switch presentations here for our first speaker, so just bear with me for a moment. And Tom Duncan will lead off. So Tom, your first slide is up.
Okay, I'm up. Okay, well, thanks, Jim. And thanks everyone for their interest in this subject. The point of my presentation is to really describe the First Nation ADAPT program, essentially to talk about the objectives, something I think about how to prepare a proposal for our program. And I'm very happy to answer questions at the end if anyone has further questions to ask. The program is for funding First Nations south of 60 to work towards increasing climate change resiliency. Essentially, we are building a big part of our program is building community capacity and promoting community participation in these projects. Maybe you could move to the next slide, please. So we have been engaging with communities over the last 2 years. We held workshops across the country in various places. And in those sessions, we heard a lot from First Nations about what types of impacts they have been experiencing. And I have just included a few in this slide, including floods, erosion, stormwater issues, especially in the Atlantic, winter road issues for sure, where winter roads are persisting for less and less time periods over the course of the last several years in Northern Ontario and in Manitoba, for example. And of course, wildfire has been a problem for many communities. You can go to the next slide, please. So as I said earlier, a big focus for our program is to do these Indigenous adaptation projects. And in doing so, we really want to ensure that we're building community capacity. We are also looking to these projects to be championed by the communities themselves. It's important that we feel communities are very much involved, and therefore we feel the results of the work will be maintained in the community for a longer period of time. The result, we want as a result of this for there to be community champions who will continue the adaptation efforts in the community, as well as perhaps even mentor other communities in the future. We're also looking to see as much as possible seeing Indigenous knowledge be incorporated as well into the project. Next slide. In terms of program funding, we have approximately $9 million per year, and that equates to, we think, usually it would be around 50 projects per year. And we have actually divided that program into two different sections. One is on adaptation studies and assessments, and the other is on floodplain mapping. So we can go to the next slide. We have identified 4 priority areas, and the first one being inland flooding or riverine flooding. Next is fire, wildfire, winter roads, and sea level rise and coastal erosion type issues. And the idea is that we do want to target some sort of fundamental types of issues and to focus on these. Can I go to the next slide, please? First Nation ADAPT program is looking at some basic community priority areas. And these areas include community infrastructure. And we also, as opposed to issues around health, for example, we also are looking at communities that are experiencing repeated and severe climate change impacts. Next slide. For the proposals, we do not have a call for proposal process. We can take in proposals at any time throughout the year. We, as I said earlier, I've said this, I will repeat myself, apologize for that, but just because it is really important for us to see strong community participation in these projects as well. As I said earlier as well, we are looking for Indigenous knowledge to be incorporated into projects, as it's one of these issues where we just feel the results of the project will have more meaning for communities if we have Indigenous knowledge included. The program will assist in the preparation of proposals. So if a community has an idea and they are having capacity issues in getting the proposal completed, or they have a bunch of questions and it's stalling their process, that they should feel free to call our program, and I'll ensure that contact information is provided. As a result of this talk and your involvement, you will hear from us on how to contact us for sure. And just in very general terms, proposals need to describe what the climate change issue is in very, like what the community is actually concerned about, and it doesn't need to be overly involved, but just a general description. Obviously, we need to know some kind of budget requirement of the project. We need to know how the community will be taking part in the project, and some kind of methodology about how the work is going to be carried out. So next slide. In a very general way, I just wanted to put out a general figure about the average funding, and 160,000 is a middle ground, I guess. We get a lot of projects that are less expensive than this, and we do have more projects that are more expensive. But 160,000 is a pretty good average, I think. We can fund single year or multi-year projects. We have included partners in our budget, and it's nice to see partners, but partners are not a requirement. It's nice to start to see sometimes in-kind contributions to projects or cash contributions from partners, but as I said, it's not required. We can have projects that are locally focused, or we can have projects that are regional. And I said earlier, when I mentioned the floodplain mapping component of our program, that kind of lends itself to regional studies. So in that case, we're going to likely see more regional studies rather than local studies. So next slide. Typical project types. I'd say 90% of our projects are risk assessments. So essentially, these are studies that answer, what is the degree of risk, how is the community at risk, and why. Another sort of secondary study could be a study looking at what the community's adaptation options and recommendations might be. And then another one we will fund our cost-benefit analysis. So in determining optimal ways to improve the community resiliency. So the next slide, please. So these are examples of projects. And this is going from fairly high level studies to much more technical studies. And in terms of this, and I thought really a lot of times, the first time we work with communities, what they want to do is some really basic work where they're talking to community members about what issues and concerns the community has, doing community workshops around climate change and what adaptation might mean, and then moving into things like hazard maps and fire smart assessments, that kind of thing, and into more technical areas where you're doing a lot more work on, for example, climate change projections, flood maps, and storm surge models. Okay, just the next slide then. So I just thought I would just run through maybe some of the contents that we typically see in our proposals. And just to say as well, we do have a program guidelines document that we will be making available. Well, and it has been available. I should say we're updating it, and the update will be available in the next few weeks, we hope, and we'll be sending that out to people. So the first thing, as I said earlier, we need to know in general terms what climate change related concerns and issues the community is experiencing. We'd like to know who the community or who the proponent actually is. So the community name, if it's a First Nation or Indigenous organization, we can fund as communities. Obviously, we can fund Indigenous organizations. And the adaptation project type, we like to know what the plan is in terms of whether you're doing an assessment, whether you're doing determination of recommendations or a cost benefit analysis. And if you could also identify the number 4 there, the climate impact priority type. So whether it's forest fires you're dealing with or sea level rise, one of the 4 issues or impact areas that I mentioned before. So the next slide, number 5, was a description of methodology. Obviously how you're going to carry out the work. And we do need a indication of the community agreement, so we're asking for a band council resolution. And finally, we are asking for a budget. We do need to know how the breakdown of costs are going to look like, and we do have a budget template that we will send to people, as well as it'll go along with the program guidelines. In terms of work plan, we actually don't need that, so that's need to update this slide, obviously. So really, that's about, that is the end of my slide deck. And I just wanted to show you this graphic illustration. It was done at one of our engagement sessions. And just sort of give you a bit of a sense of what does get discussed at the sessions that we held, and we'll likely be doing more of these sessions in the future. But anyways, those were really good opportunities for us to touch base with community people and find out where their concerns were in terms of climate change impacts. That email address down below is a generic email address for our program, if you maybe want to quickly jot that down. But as I said before, we'll also make our contact information. I have my own contact email, obviously, for myself, and I actually work with a team of officers or technicians in our group, and I deal with BC and the Atlantic regions, and we have other individuals that deal with other parts of Canada. So if you just email me or email the generic email, we'll point you in the right direction depending on where you're living. So if you do have some questions right now, I'm definitely available to answer those questions now or after Trevor's talk.
Well, why don't we take a few questions right now while the information is fresh in people's minds. just while people are thinking about those questions that you can type into the question box, I'm just going to switch presenters so Trevor can get ready here. There have been some questions about the presentation, and we will be making the recording of this available to folks afterwards. It's linked to our website, as I mentioned, but so it is available if you've missed part of it or if there's information you want to review. So I have a first question here is, does the fund pay for implementation, or does it only focus on assessment and planning? And that's a question from Ged.
Yeah, that's a good question. We only fund planning and assessments. Yeah, we have a different group within our department that would do implementation. The program will definitely help coordinate or assist and support projects in moving towards the implementation stages, but our funding authority doesn't include actual building or construction. So, we are working. We do work quite close with our infrastructure people in our department, and as I said, we do things to try to facilitate the advancement of the adaptation effort, essentially. So we typically, what we do as well is we'll send the infrastructure group a heads up that this work is being done. We actually sometimes get them to review proposals that we're working on, so that what we're doing makes sense in their minds. But being two different programs, I can't say obviously that we automatically move into implementation. There's another process that takes care of those construction capital projects.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've got quite a few questions, so we'll get through as many as we can, and we'll definitely forward them if there are any that we can't get to in the time that we've got here. We will certainly forward them to Tom, or we'll circulate the contact information as well, so you can follow up directly. The question is, where can you find examples of past funded First Nations ADAPT projects? Is there somewhere where that information exists?
Well, gee, that's a good. We used to have a list on our website, and I believe those are still there, but I think what that person maybe should do is contact me directly, and I can point them in that direction. They may want more information as well. In some cases, we have final reports. In other words, the results of these studies, but those final reports are the property of the First Nations, and we have to get permission to share those reports. We do, as I said before, though, we used to have a list of our past projects and a very quick summary, the title and a quick summary of the projects on our website. So I think that's still there. And in any case that we are constantly doing, there's work going on as we currently this year, and that list will have to be updated for this year's projects at a minimum.
Tom, you mentioned that the program's approximately 9 million a year, but the slide said something about 4 million. Someone's just looking for clarification on that.
Well, I think it said, I forget, I have 4 million. Essentially what it is that those are, the slide is trying to say there's 4 million for First Nation community projects. There was an additional 27 million that's spread over 5 years. So if you do the math, that's about 9 million per year, and over the next 5 years. So that was the 4 million is for the First Nation ADAPT program. The second amount was for the floodplain mapping. So I know it's confusing, sorry about that. Essentially, it's around 4 or 5 million per sub-program going forward. The floodplain mapping, however, is only for 5 years, and the First Nation ADAPT funding is ongoing.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. In terms of the requirement for a band council resolution How can this be fulfilled if the proposal is coming from a First Nations conglomerate or organization?
Well, the work would need to be done in some kind of area, region, location. Probably a community is going to be involved. So we do need clarification that that community is aware of the project, is on side with the project, that kind of thing. So I know it could be, we have tribal councils, for example, doing projects. We ask that there be an indication that the communities involved are on side. So in that case, we often just ask for a letter of support.
Okay, great. Question of clarification from Kathy. So the program, or does the program fund projects that are off reserve? This group has a proposal to develop a water responsibility plan for a watershed in their territory, which includes issues such as adaptation, flooding, and drought.
Yes, we would, as long as the area is sort of within their traditional territory, and you have I think it's whatever jurisdiction. I think we'd want the jurisdiction involved to be aware of the project. But for example, for floodplain mapping, it's obviously more of a regional type of assessment, and the expectation is it could be off reserve, as well as, I would assume, on reserve as well, but clearly some of the work would be required off reserve.
Okay. Kathy Hopkins is asking about whether you could comment on how many locations in BC have had workshops or projects.
Well, in terms of workshops, that's easier to answer. We've had one in Richmond and one in Kamloops, and we're having another session this April again in Richmond. But in terms of projects, it's a lot. So we have two projects for example, they're doing coastal vulnerability studies on several First Nation communities, and so there are approximately, I think, 12 in the south, and about 20 communities right now are being assessed in the north on the coast. We have probably about 6 or 7 projects going on this year in the interior BC, and that could be fire related or riverine flood type assessments.
Okay, great. Yeah, good to have some examples. I think we have time for one more question at this point, and then we'll hand things over to Trevor. And if we have time, we'll get to more of the questions at the end. Can assessments be made on culturally significant plants and how they're being impacted by climate change?
That's a good question. I think that could be a bit tricky. It sounds like that could be more of a food security cultural, and therefore it might be like less infrastructure, obviously. So I'm thinking that might fit better with FNIB's Climate Change Health Adaptation Program. But I'd invite that person to follow up with me, and we can figure that out. But I'd say right now that might be a bit of a stretch for our program.
Okay, so there's your audio broke up a little bit, but it sounds like there's the climate change program at the Health Canada would be potentially an option.
That's right. Yeah, FNIB. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks very much, Tom, and please stick around. But we'll hand things over to Trevor and take it away, Trevor.
Okay. Thank you. And how is the audio?
That sounds good. Nice and clear.
Sounds good. Okay. So before I start, I do want to acknowledge with respect that where I'm sitting during this webinar is at University of Victoria, which is on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, as represented by Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples who continue to live, work, and play on these lands. And I'm going to, I think I can advance my own slides here. Yes. So I'm going to cover 4 things here: climate variability and future projections, and then ask this question. Tom talked about the program informing resilience. So I'm going to pose this question: do we even need need future projections to improve resilience. And then I'll talk to you a little bit about using climate information and some resources. So the nutrition facts for what you're about to consume. There's a few maps in here, and this humor question, yeah, no cartoons. And if you didn't find this funny, then that 5% is not correct either for humor. So also, yeah, this is important. Allergy alert. Please forgive me if I make any mistakes of ignorance, and feel free to correct. You can make the comment. I don't actually see the comments, but Jim or Elena could copy and paste them to me. So first, just a little bit about the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, where I work. We were founded in 2005. You may also have heard of the Pacific Institute with Climate Solutions, which has almost the same name as us. We're located in the same building, but we have a bit of a different focus. So PICS is focused on this sort of policy relevant research to try to mostly to reduce climate change by reducing emissions. They're also interested in adaptation, whereas PCIC is really focused on the future, sort of characterizing the condition of the future. So we end up informing adaptation. And so we make use of recent findings from climate research, and we're really very applied. So we focus on these applications, planning, design, and decision-making. These three sections of PCIC are the three main, we're sort of divided into these three groups. So I lead the regional climate impacts theme here at PCIC, and as listed in the bullets there, we focus a lot on trying to bring these climate projections that we have from global climate models down to a local or regional scale, and create some meaning out of them, and produce indices of extremes that are relevant to infrastructure, and work with people to make use of that information. We also have a hydrologic impacts group here that they've done a lot of work. Their sort of main customer is BC Hydro, but they do hydrological modeling that, of course, is of interest throughout the province, and so they are able to produce future projections of stream flow. And then we also have a climate analysis and monitoring group. So this is these folks are more focused on historical records, historical observations, increasing the density of the station network by putting Environment Canada stations plus different BC ministries, BC Hydro, Rio Tinto Alcan, and anybody who has an observing network and wants to include their stations into one common quality controlled data set can do that. So focus on the historical analysis, and then also looking just a little bit into the future with seasonal climate projections. So based on El Nino, La Nina, and that sort of thing. And also a little bit of analysis of last year. So when we have weird years like a lot of snow days in the Lower Mainland, this group will put out some analysis of how unlikely was that? How often have we had that in the past, and what's the chance of that in the future? That sort of thing. Okay, so moving into the future. So what we're looking at here, this is why I have the nutrition information to sort of warn folks that I'll get a little bit technical here. So what we're looking at is the black line, if you average over all of British Columbia and average over a year, you have 1 point for each year. So this is the annual average temperature going back several decades. And you can see it's very wiggly. So this is climate variability. We have a lot of year-to-year variability. If you were to look at, for example, 2005 stands out as one of the warmest years. That's the year we had the Kelowna wildfires. These last 2 years have been very warm, and we've had wildfires associated with those years, and other impacts associated with that. A similar thing, if you look at some of the coldest years, they would tend to be years with lots of flooding on the Fraser as snow accumulates over the winter and then melts in the spring. So a couple of degrees difference between these sort of warmest of the warm years and coldest of the cold years is kind of a big deal. And so if we move forward in time, so just focusing on this red line for now, they have these really inelegant names. This is RCP 8.5, but essentially you can think of this is business as usual. If we just keep emitting greenhouse gases at sort of the pace we have been, this is where the average temperature in BC is headed. So the average will be the dark red line, and then the light red lines around that that represents where the future year-to-year variability would be. It's a little bit wider than the variability in past because there's also climate model uncertainty. So these models are not perfect. And so that's reflected in quite a wide range. But even if you look at the low end of this range, so the coldest of the cold years in future, by the end of the century, those, if you sort of slide your eyes over to the left, you can see that those don't intersect with anything in the recorded record of the historical observations that I'm showing here. So we're really talking about a completely different place. If you were to imagine that these really warm years we've had lately with the impacts that are associated with them, if that's the new crazy cold year that causes impacts because it's so cold and the normal is warmer than that, that's really quite a different place. Another way of thinking of this is that BC has not had these. If you sort of look back in time, when's the last time BC has had temperatures like this? You have to go back millions of years to get temperatures of that. So we're talking completely different landscapes. Now we have these other two lines here. It's not the business as usual isn't the only option. So this yellow line represents the projected climate change for BC under about half of the emissions of that red line. And then this blue line is if we can manage to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to about net zero. So we'll still be emitting some greenhouse gases, but we need to find some technology to suck carbon out of the air and maintain a net zero going forward. Then this is the climate change projection that we have over the next century. And so even under this scenario, we're still going to need to adapt to that new climate. So this requires a lot of mitigation, and by mitigation, I just mean reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So of course, it'd be better to try to adapt to this lower amount of climate change than the higher amount of climate change, but it's still we're still looking at a climate that's quite different from at least this observed past. Where you're looking at a new normal that's like the extreme warm years of the past. The good news is that if we're talking about infrastructure in particular, and we're most of the timescales of infrastructure, we're probably caring about the middle of the century. And you can see that the scenarios are fairly similar to each other by then. So we don't necessarily have to know for sure if we're on the business as usual scenario or a more optimistic in terms of reducing our emissions scenario. And so there's less uncertainty by the middle of the century than the end of the century. So if our infrastructure cares about the middle of the century, it's less of an issue. But the other point is I've shown, this is just what the BC Building Code uses for temperature. And there's various historical baselines that are used for different things. But that past line is definitely outside of any of the future. So even if you were to, there's more uncertainty in terms of which of those three lines are we on. But what we definitely know is that we're not, in all of those cases, climate is changing. All right, so now moving into what does this mean on the landscape, and just to say a little bit, use an example of that to talk about really the rate and change of magnitude, because I was really there just showing, comparing future projections to recent decades and historical records. What I'm showing here is impact on suitability of spruce, and so the colors show the number of climate model projections that indicate suitability. And so the green is very suitable, and the brown is no models indicate suitability. And you can see as we go through this century, the suitability of spruce this is in the Kootenays, in the southeast corner of the province. You can see the suitability of spruce just going to near zero for all but the highest elevation areas. And of course, the spruce don't disappear immediately, but this just means that if you're replanting trees, spruce may not be the best choice here. And I'm just showing this example. It's pretty dramatic. Other species wouldn't necessarily show as much of a change. And there is also positive stories. There are species that may not have been suitable in the past that may be suitable in the future. But the question that was asked earlier about, culturally important species, we really are looking at a speed of change and an amount of change that may even be larger than it was represented in oral history, which of course goes back much further than the historical records I was showing. But we were really looking at, again, an amount of climate change by the end of the century under this business as usual scenario in particular, which is what this is following, that is a completely different place and could put us in a location where culturally important species are just not suitable to be grown inside a territory that they were previously important. Okay, so that's not exciting. So what can we do about it? So I'm going to pose this question, and there's going to be a poll here in a moment. And do we even need these future climate projections is the question here. So playing devil's advocate a little bit. And so what I'm showing here is two different drinking water watersheds. It doesn't matter exactly where they are, but they are both from BC. And the concept here is on the left, if we have a drinking water watershed that is rain dominated or mostly rain dominated, so it doesn't really matter. It doesn't depend on getting cold enough for there to be snowpack in this. Maybe it's a coastal watershed or low elevation. And so your reservoir is already, because historically you didn't depend on snowpack, the reservoir is already large enough to just, all it needs is enough rainfall during the year and you're fine for water supply. On the right, we have a water supply reservoir in an area which is snow dominated watershed. So this isn't using any information about the future. This is just knowing your area. And you know that in this area, if you depend on snowpack as climate warms, your reservoir may be undersized because snowpacks may reduce, and if you're depending on accumulating that snow during the winter season and then having it melt in the spring and summer for your water supply, that's something you want to look at. So we already know, without looking at detailed climate projections, which one of these locations is more vulnerable to that. And there may be things you can do immediately to start planning for that and just become more resilient. And the watershed on the right needs to think about becoming more resilient in terms of its water supply, and the one on the left doesn't need to be concerned about at least that aspect of it. So here's the question. I think Jim is going to fire up a poll. And so the question is, option A, do we need these estimated future conditions to plan? Or B, can we just become more resilient to change instead? We know, the direction that things are headed, and I've given you a sense of the magnitude. So the question is that enough? And Jim, I can't tell if this thing is visible to people or how many people have answered. So
Yeah, we'll just give them, everyone's still voting here. So
okay.
Another minute, and then we'll show the results. You should be able to see them. So
okay.
Okay, well, I think all right, I think we get an idea at this point of where people are at. So here you go.
Okay.
Can you see the results, Trevor?
No, but maybe you can just tell me.
Okay, well, I'll explain it then. That's an odd feature. Okay, so the result is that 80% of people agreed with that the statement that estimated future conditions are needed for planning, and 20% said we can become more resilient to change instead.
Okay, so now for those of you who haven't seen me present before, you don't know how cheeky I am. So I don't know how many people abstained from voting, because that was really a setup. This is really, this is not an either-or question. And so what I'm going to try to suggest is that there's a role to be played for using the future climate information, future climate conditions. They're useful to help prioritize becoming resilient to climate change. So it's kind of this is a thing where two things that sound contradictory can actually be true. So on the one hand, if there are areas where just by talking about, hey, how are we vulnerable to climate change in this location? Oh yeah, something, you get together as a community and you identify something that's a vulnerability and you can become more resilient. Maybe that's worth just going ahead and doing it. For other things, where especially infrastructure, where you're talking about spending, you're spending scarce resources on buildings or roads or something like that, and you want to make it more resilient to climate change, you'd like some confidence that that money is being spent wisely and is going to pay back. And so that might be a role for using the best information you have available to you. So on the one hand, not having climate projections shouldn't stop adaptation planning from happening, but there is also a role for the projections in making those plans as specific as possible. So hopefully that makes sense. And so with that, I'll say a little bit about the stuff that PCIC would provide, the technical stuff that PCIC would provide if we were to collaborate on a project like this. And then I'll end with some resources for stuff that's freely available that you could use without working directly with PCIC. So we have these high resolution daily projections available to us, and there's kind of two different resolutions which you can see on this screen. So we take the global climate model results and downscale them to this 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer scale. Oops. What happened there? Are we on the map?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. My screen did something weird. All right, so we downscale them to this 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer scale, but then we also have historical observations at a very high resolution. And for things like the number of days below freezing in BC, where we have such complex topography, that 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers washes out a lot of that complex topography. So before you calculate the number of days below freezing, you want to know if you're at the top of Grouse Mountain or halfway up or down at sea level. And so we can correct for that down to this 800 meter by 800 meter level. And we have a whole suite of these indices of climate extremes that we've used. And I'm just going to show these co-produced climate reports. They've all been done with, so far, with regional districts. This is, of course, a very different level of government, but I'm showing these because the way we produce them, I think, would be a good fit for the First Nation ADAPT program. As Tom mentioned, it's important to build capacity within the community, and these projects, I think, represent the most intense and most iterative work that we've done so far on providing climate impacts to a region and building the capacity within that region so that they could produce their own reports. So PCIC's role has been to ensure that the information was interpreted accurately, and also to provide maps and tables. And our role is to pass along some knowledge so that the community itself can produce their own report. And by having the local jurisdiction involved directly, rather than just us producing a report and handing off, they make sure that the results are tailored to the local needs. And the other thing that these reports have been able to do, I'll show this in a couple slides, is instead of just talking about the climate impacts, there's a little bit of, and so what does this mean? So there's a little bit of adaptation done right within these reports, although the main focus is to have the climate impacts all in one place for further adaptation projects. And so I'll just go through the last quickly so we have more time for questions. This is just an example of the kinds of things that have come out of one of these reports. These are sort of the things that bubbled to the surface. We looked at a few dozen different indices of climate extremes, and these were the ones that mattered within the capital region. And as I mentioned, there's this sort of filtering of, so what do all these projections mean in terms of different areas of impact? So about half of the report was on the climate projections, and the second half of these reports are on, so what do these impacts mean in this far as written by the local government, in this case, the regional district, but this could be done for any jurisdiction. And we have a couple of similar projects going on that are now with provincial ministries or industry associations, so it doesn't need to be limited to regional districts. In terms of pointing at, so the stuff I just talked about is working with PCIC directly and using the kind of latest, greatest climate data that we have available to us, but isn't available on our online tools yet. It is available in raw format for download, anyone can use, but we're still working on adding it to all of our online tools. So, but in terms of what is freely available, I just recommend this BC RAC webinar that happened last year, or I guess it's a year and a bit ago now. And also just want to end with a list of resources. I won't go through these. These are just there. You all have the slide deck, so you can click on them. A little bit of a focus on infrastructure things at the top there, and then links to the climate reports that have been done this way. And that's it for me.
Great, thanks very much, Trevor. I appreciate that. And there have been some questions about the PowerPoint slides. We will make a PDF of these slides available to everyone for afterwards. There's lots of information and links that would be hard to jot down quickly. And as well, there was one slide a few people commented on. Trevor, your temperature slide, I think the time axis was missing. So if you're looking for that, we'll make sure you get the slides that you can look at afterwards. So at this point, we've got some time for questions, both either for Trevor or for Tom. I guess maybe initially, if there's some questions for Trevor on what he's talked about, well, that's just fresh in your minds as well. Happy to answer any of those. Amanda Broad from the provincial government mentions another site that would be worth looking at, which is called Climate Telling, climattelling.info, which is a web portal for related to climate change and impact facing Indigenous communities in Canada. So check that out as well. There's links to some of these other programs that that folks have asked about. Okay, so
I'll just say,
yeah,
Jim, while you're sort of choosing a question, I'll just say that, yeah, it looks like I wasn't looking at the questions while I was talking, and it sounded like the bottom of all of the slides were cut off, but those are all there. That must have been something to do with the webinar technology. So the slides itself, it does have time axes and things like that. That's all. That'll be on the slides.
Okay, great. That's good to know. And that was just the one slide where that was missing. Okay, I think it looks like most of these questions are focused on, other than the question about that slide or for Tom. So I'll start with a couple more. Oh, sorry, there's a couple questions here for you, Trevor. One is, are the spatial resolution standardized, or are they highly dependent on the data availability?
How do I answer that quickly? The spatial resolution, yeah, there's different sort of levels of detail of information available, and the spatial resolution does vary depending on what you're interested in. It doesn't really change with. I guess the main thing that I would mention is that we have much higher resolution information for temperature, like daily temperature and daily precipitation. Anything that is more complex, and anything that can be derived from daily temperature and precipitation. So there's a lot of indices of extremes, like the 1 in 20 year one-day storm, or number of days above 25 Celsius, and a whole bunch of indices like that that depend on daily nighttime low, daily daytime high, and daily precipitation. Those three. Much more detailed information than any other variables. It's probably the main thing.
Okay. A question from Karen Sharp is, if we were to work with PKIC on a project, would we work with you to draft a proposal or bring a proposal to you? And does PKIC charge for their project delivery?
Yeah, so PKIC does, we operate, so we're funded by the same endowment that funds Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. And we use that endowment to basically leverage into sort of double or triple that using projects. So we operate on a cost recovery basis for our time. And yeah, we would just bat around an estimate. We've so far only have one project, one First Nation Adapt project that PKIC has been involved in. And the way that one worked is we were brought in last. I think either option could work, where we scope out the work that you're interested in from us first, and then talk to Tom. That hasn't been explored a lot yet.
Okay.
I could just say, yeah, Jim, that would be a very fundable endeavor from our perspective. So it'd be something a community could add to their budget costs, for example.
Okay. A couple of questions here, maybe for you, Tom, while you're on the line. One is, for multi-year projects, how many years can the project span?
Well, there is no, we don't have a black and white date at all. Whatever would be reasonable would be the criteria used. And I mean, just to look at some past projects, I think the longest one we have is currently 3 years. So, you know, that gives you a bit of a ballpark. I mean, and the other thing is our program had been around for quite some time and before now, and up to fairly recently, all our projects were only single year.
Mm-hmm.
So looking back, I mean, this year and last year was our kickoff year. You know, almost every project now is multi-year to some extent. Like they start late this year, let's say, and they're moving into next year. That would be a multi-year, but only maybe you know, for 8 months or something. But I think it's something that makes a lot of sense. People can kind of sink their teeth into a project for a longer period of time, get a lot more buy-in within the community over a longer length of time. So we see a lot of value in these longer-term projects.
Great. And we had a couple questions here around other organizations or levels of government being involved. So for example, can a regional government apply for the funding in partnership with a group of First Nations communities, or can a community partner with an external organization if they lack capacity?
Well, the only issue for us is that the recipient needs to be a First Nation or a First Nation Indigenous organization. But as long as we can work through that, we're actually doing a project in the Capital Regional District, and yeah, so we kind of were approached by the Capital Regional District first, but then we got a community. The community was engaged, and we had a lot of discussions with that community and brought them in, and so the proposal came from the community ultimately. And I think that's what we ultimately need to have, is the proposal needs to essentially come eventually from the community once it's fully fleshed out, and so they are essentially our recipient. And then a district can be involved, and we welcome that, because we want as many neighbors to be involved in these pieces of work. So it's I think that way that you get the most effective result.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sounds good. I think we have time for perhaps one more question, which is, would the program be able to look at kind of landslide type issues or threats? This is quite an important hazard in coastal BC.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I guess we would call that erosion or something. I'm not sure where that would fall under, but it's certainly flood related. So that's where that would fit, and I would say we would be able to look at that kind of impact. Yes.
Okay, great. Maybe just one more question for Trevor. Is UVic interested in partnering with First Nations to study the impacts of climate change by having master's or PhD students address our issues?
I can't speak for UVic as an institution. I would think the answer to that is yes. PKIC does, so we're located at UVic, and we do have grad students involved in projects. They tend to be separate from, so we have kind of two different kinds of projects. We have more researchy projects, and then we have these more applied work that we do with users of various types, whether levels of government or industry associations, basically anyone who's interested in future climate information in BC. So typically those sort of academic positions, grad positions, have been associated with academic funding. But I don't see any reason, if an application was made to the First Nation Adapt program and that's something that they wanted to fund, us supervising a student is certainly that's certainly a role that we would be happy to play.
Great. Well, I appreciate everyone's questions. We've had many questions, and some of them we've run out of time and we can't answer all of them. but we will commit to getting the questions to our speakers so that we can get answers back to you. And really appreciate the two presenters talking today. Lots of great information and links. And I look forward to future opportunities to connect you with key climate information programs that are available. The contact information for myself, for Jim Vanderwall, and for Elena Chia is on the screen. So feel free to reach out to either of us if you're looking to learn more, to make connections to these programs. We're there to try and help you navigate and be successful with what you'd like to do in your community. Just one last word, we'd like to thank the federal government through Natural Resources Canada, as well as the province of BC for their financial support for our outreach work. Thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.